In 18th century France, there lived a man who was one of the most gifted and abominable personages in an era that knew no lack of gifted and abominable personages. His story will be told here. His name was Jean-Baptiste Grenouille, and if his name, in contrast to the names of other gifted abominations, de Sades, for instance, or Saint-Justes, Fouchés, Bonapartes, etc., has been forgotten today, it is certainly not because Grenouille fell short of those more famous blackguards when it came to arrogance, misanthropy, immorality, or, more succinctly, wickedness, but because his gifts and his sole ambition were restricted to a domain that leaves no traces in history, to the fleeting realm of scent. In the period of which we speak, there reigned in the cities a stench barely conceivable to us modern men and women. The streets stank of manure, the courtyards of urine, the stairwells stank of mouldering wood and rat droppings, the kitchens of spoiled cabbage and mutton fat, the unaired parlours stank of stale dust, the bedrooms of greasy sheets, damp feather beds, and the pungently sweet aroma of chamber pots. The stench of sulphur rose from the chimneys, the stench of caustic lies from the tanneries, and from the slaughterhouses came the stench of congealed blood. People stank of sweat and unwashed clothes. From their mouths came the stench of rotting teeth, from their bellies that of onions, and from their bodies, if they were no longer very young, came the stench of rancid cheese and sour milk and tumorous disease. The rivers stank, the marketplaces stank, the churches stank, it stank beneath the bridges and in the palaces. The peasant stank as did the priest, the apprentice as did his master's wife, the whole of the aristocracy stank, even the king himself stank like a rank lion, and the queen like an old goat, summer and winter. For in the 18th century there was nothing to hinder bacteria busy at decomposition, and so there was no human activity, either constructive or destructive, no manifestation of germinating or decaying life, that was not accompanied by stench. And of course the stench was foulest in Paris, for Paris was the largest city of France. And in turn there was a spot in Paris under the sway of particularly fiendish stench. Between the Rue aux Fers and the Rue de la Ferronnerie, the Cimetière des Innocents, to be exact. For 800 years the dead had been brought here from the Hôtel Dieu and from the surrounding parish churches. For 800 years, day in, day out, corpses by the dozens had been carted here and tossed into long ditches, stacked bone upon bone for 800 years in the tombs and charnel houses. Only later, on the eve of the Revolution, after several of the grave pits had caved in and the stench had driven the swollen graveyard's neighbours to more than mere protest and to actual insurrection, was it finally closed and abandoned. Millions of bones and skulls were shovelled into the catacombs of Montmartre, and in its place a food market was erected. Here then, on the most putrid spot in the whole kingdom, Jean-Baptiste Grenouille was born on the 17th of July, 1738. It was one of the hottest days of the year. The heat lay leaden upon the graveyard, squeezing its putrefying vapour, a blend of rotting melon and the fetid odour of burnt animal horn, out into the nearby alleys. When the labour pains began, Grenouille's mother was standing at a fish stall in the Rue aux Fers, scaling whiting that she had just gutted. The fish, ostensibly taken that very morning from the Seine, already stank so vilely that the smell masked the odour of corpses. Grenouille's mother, however, perceived the odour neither of the fish nor of the corpses, for her sense of smell had been utterly dulled, besides which her belly hurt and the pain deadened all susceptibility to sensate impressions. She only wanted the pain to stop. She wanted to put this revolting birth behind her as quickly as possible. It was her fifth. She had effected all the others here at the fish booth, and all had been stillbirths, or semi-stillbirths, for the bloody meat that emerged had not differed greatly from the fish guts that lay there already, nor had lived much longer, and by evening the whole mess had been shoveled away and carted off to the graveyard or down to the river. It would be much the same today, and Grenouille's mother, who was still a young woman, barely in her mid-20s, and who still was quite pretty, and had almost all her teeth in her mouth and some hair on her head, and, except for gout and syphilis and a touch of consumption, suffered from no serious disease, who still hoped to live a while yet, perhaps a good 5 or 10 years, and perhaps even to marry one day, and as the honourable wife of a widower with a trade or some such, to bear real children. Grenouille's mother wished that it were already over. And when the final contractions began, she squatted down under the gutting table, and there gave birth, as she had done 4 times before, and cut the newborn thing's umbilical cord with her gutting knife. But then, on account of the heat and the stench, which she did not perceive as such, but only as an unbearable, numbing something, like a field of lilies or a small room filled with too many narcissi, she grew faint, toppled to one side, fell out from under the table into the street, and lay there, knife in hand. Tumult and turmoil. The crowd stands in a circle around her, staring. Someone hails the police. The woman with the knife in her hand is still lying in the street. Slowly she comes to. What has happened to her? Nothing. What is she doing with that knife? Nothing. Where does the blood on her skirt come from? From the fish. She stands up, tosses the knife aside, and walks off to wash. And then, unexpectedly, the infant under the gutting table begins to squall. They have a look, and beneath a swarm of flies and amid the offal and fish heads, they discover a newborn child. They pull it out. As prescribed by law, they give it to a wet nurse and arrest the mother. And since she confesses, openly admitting that she would definitely have let the thing perish, just as she had with those other 4, by the way, she is tried, found guilty of multiple infanticide, and a few weeks later decapitated at the Place de Grève. By that time, the child had already changed wet nurses 3 times. No one wanted to keep it for more than a couple of days. It was too greedy, they said, sucked as much as 2 babies, deprived the other sucklings of milk, and them, the wet nurses, of their livelihood, for it was impossible to make a living nursing just 1 babe. The police officer in charge, a man named Lafosse, instantly wearied of the matter and wanted to have the child sent to a halfway house for foundlings and orphans at the far end of the Rue Saint-Antoine, from which transports of children were dispatched daily to the great public orphanage in Rouen. But since these convoys were made up of porters who carried bark baskets into which, for reasons of economy, up to 4 infants were placed at a time, since therefore the mortality rate on the road was extraordinarily high, since for that reason the porters were urged to convey only baptized infants and only those furnished with an official certificate of transport to be stamped upon arrival in Rouen, since the babe Grenouille had neither been baptized nor received even so much as a name to inscribe officially on the certificate of transport, since, moreover, it would not have been good form for the police anonymously to set a child at the gates of the halfway house, which would have been the only way to save the other formalities. Thus, because of a whole series of bureaucratic and administrative difficulties that seemed likely to occur if the child was shunted aside, and because time was short as well, Officer Lafosse revoked his original decision and gave instructions for the boy to be handed over, on written receipt, to some ecclesiastical institution or other, so that there they could baptize him and decide his further fate. He got rid of him at the cloister of Saint-Méry in the Rue Saint-Martin. There they baptized him with the name Jean-Baptiste. And because on that day the prior was in a good mood and the eleemosynary fund not yet exhausted, they did not have the child shipped to Rouen, but instead pampered him at the cloister's expense. To this end he was given to a wet nurse named Jeanne Grenouille, who lived in the Rue Saint-Denis, and was to receive, until further notice, 3 francs per week for her trouble. A few weeks later, the wet nurse, Jeanne Grenouille, stood, market-basket in hand, at the gates of the cloister of Saint-Méry, and the minute they were opened by a bald monk of about 50, with a faint odour of vinegar about him, Father Terrier, she said, "There," and set her market-basket down on the threshold. "What's that?" asked Terrier, bending down over the basket and sniffing at it in the hope that it was something edible.
"The bastard of that woman from the Rue aux Fers who killed her babies."
The monk poked about in the basket with his finger until he had exposed the face of the sleeping infant.
"He looks good, rosy pink and well-nourished." "Because he's stuffed himself on me. Because he's pumped me dry down to the bones. But I've put a stop to that. Now you can feed him yourselves with goat's milk, with pap, with beet juice. He'll gobble up anything, that bastard will."
Father Terrier was an easygoing man. Among his duties was the administration of the cloister's charities, the distribution of its moneys to the poor and needy. And for that he expected a thank you, and that he not be bothered further. He despised technical details, because details meant difficulties, and difficulties meant ruffling his composure, and he simply would not put up with that. He was upset that he had even opened the gate. He wished that this female would take her market basket and go home and let him alone with her suckling problems. Slowly he straightened up, and as he did, he breathed the scent of milk and cheesy wool exuded by the wet nurse. It was a pleasant aroma.
"I don't understand what it is you want. I really don't understand what you are getting at. I can only presume that it would certainly do no harm to this infant if he were to spend a good while yet lying at your breast." "None to him," the wet nurse snarled back, "but plenty to me. I've lost 10 pounds and been eating like I was 3 women. And for what? For 3 francs a week?"
"Ah, I understand," said Terrier, almost relieved. "I catch your drift. Once again, it's a matter of money."
"No,"
said the wet nurse. "Of course it is. It's always a matter of money. When there's a knock at this gate, it's a matter of money. Just once I'd like to open it and find someone standing there for whom it was a matter of something else. Someone, for instance, with some little show of thoughtfulness. Fruit, perhaps, or a few nuts. After all, in autumn there are lots of things someone could come by with. Flowers, maybe. Or if only someone would simply come and say a friendly word. 'God bless you, Father Terrier. I wish you a good day.' But I'll probably never live to see it happen. If it isn't a beggar, it's a merchant, and if it isn't a merchant, it's a tradesman, and if it isn't alms he wants, then he presents me with a bill. I can't even go out into the street any more. When I go out on the street, I can't take 3 steps before I'm hedged in by folk wanting money."
"Not me," said the wet nurse. "But I'll tell you this. You aren't the only wet nurse in the parish. There are hundreds of excellent foster mothers who would scramble for the chance of putting this charming babe to their breast for 3 francs a week, or to supply him with pap or juices or whatever nourishment, then give him to one of them. On the other hand, it's not good to pass a child around like that. Who knows if he would flourish as well on someone else's milk as on yours? He's used to the smell of your breast, as you surely know, and to the beat of your heart."
And once again he inhaled deeply of the warm vapours streaming from the wet nurse. But then, noticing that his words had made no impression on her, he said, "No, take the child home with you. I'll speak to the prior about all this. I shall suggest to him that in the future you be given 4 francs a week." "No," said the wet nurse. "All right, 5.
"No." "How much more do you want, then?" Terrier shouted at her. 5 francs is a pile of money for the menial task of feeding a baby." "I don't want any money at all," said the wet nurse. "I want this bastard out of my house."
"But why, my good woman?" said Terrier, poking his finger in the basket again. "He really is an adorable child. He's rosy pink, he doesn't cry, and he's been baptized."
"He's possessed by the devil."
Terrier quickly withdrew his finger from the basket. "Impossible. It is absolutely impossible for an infant to be possessed by the devil. An infant is not yet a human being. It is a pre-human being, and does not yet possess a fully developed soul, which is why it is of no interest to the devil. Can he talk already, perhaps? Does he twitch and jerk? Does he move things about in the room? Does some evil stench come from him?"
"He doesn't smell at all," said the wet nurse.
"And there you have it. That is a clear sign. If he were possessed by the devil, then he would have to stink.
and to soothe the wet nurse, and to put his own courage to the test, Terrier lifted the basket and held it up to his nose. "I smell absolutely nothing out of the ordinary," he said, after he had sniffed for a while. "Really, nothing out of the ordinary. Though it does appear as if there's an odour coming from his nappy," and he held out the basket to her so that she could confirm his opinion. "That's not what I mean," said the wet nurse peevishly, shoving the basket away. "I don't mean what's in the nappy. His soil smells, that's true enough. But it's the bastard himself. He doesn't smell." "Because he's healthy," Terrier cried. "Because he's healthy, that's why he doesn't smell. Only sick babies smell, everyone knows that. It's well known that a child with the pox smells like horse manure, and one with scarlet fever like old apples, and a consumptive child smells like onions. He is healthy. That's all that's wrong with him. Do you think he should stink? Do your own children stink?" "No," said the wet nurse. "My children smell like human children ought to smell." Terrier carefully placed the basket back on the ground, for he could sense rising within him the first waves of his anger at this obstinate female. It was possible that he would need to move both arms more freely as the debate progressed, and he didn't want the infant to be harmed in the process. But for the present he knotted his hands behind his back, shoved his tapering belly towards the wet nurse, and asked sharply, "You maintain, then, that you know how a human child, which, may I remind you, once it is baptized is also a child of God, is supposed to smell?" "Yes," said the wet nurse. "And you further maintain that if it does not smell the way you, the wet nurse Jeanne Grenouille from the Rue Saint-Denis, think it ought to smell, it is therefore a child of the devil?" He swung his left hand out from behind his back and menacingly held the question mark of his index finger in her face. The wet nurse thought it over. She was not happy that the conversation had all at once turned into a theological cross-examination, in which she could only be the loser. "That's not what I meant to say," she answered evasively. "You priests will have to decide whether all this has anything to do with the devil or not, Father Terrier. That's not for such as me to say. I only know one thing. This baby makes my flesh creep because it doesn't smell the way children ought to smell." "Aha!" said Terrier with satisfaction, letting his arms swing away again. "You retract all that about the devil, do you? Good. But now be so kind as to tell me, what does a baby smell like when he smells the way you think he ought to smell?" "Well?" "He smells good," said the wet nurse. "What do you mean, good?" Terrier bellowed at her. "Lots of things smell good. A bouquet of lavender smells good. Stewed meat smells good. The gardens of Arabia smell good. But what does a baby smell like is what I want to know." The wet nurse hesitated. She knew very well how babies smell. She knew precisely. After all, she had fed, tended, cradled, and kissed dozens of them. She could find them at night with her nose. Why, right at that moment she bore that baby's smell clearly in her nose. But never until now had she described it in words. "Well," barked Terrier, clicking his fingernails impatiently. "Well, it's—" the wet nurse began. "It's not all that easy to say because they don't smell the same all over. Although they smell good all over, Father, you know what I mean? Their feet, for instance. They smell like a smooth, warm stone. Or no, more like curds. Or like butter, like fresh butter. That's it, exactly. They smell like fresh butter. And their bodies smell like a pancake that's been soaked in milk. And their heads up on top, at the back of the head, where the hair makes a cowlick there. See what I mean? Father, there, where you've got nothing left." And she tapped the bald spot on the head of the monk, who, struck speechless for a moment by this flood of detailed inanity, had obediently bent his head down. "There, right there, is where they smell best of all. It smells like caramel. It smells so sweet, so wonderful. Oh, Father, you have no idea. Once you've smelled them there, you love them whether they're your own or somebody else's. And that's how little children have to smell, and no other way. And if they don't smell like that, if they don't have any smell at all up there, even less than cold air does, like that little bastard there, then... You can explain it however you like, Father, but I
and she crossed her arms resolutely beneath her bosom and cast a look of disgust towards the basket at her feet, as if it contained toads.
I, Jeanne Grenouille, will not take that thing back.
Father Terrier slowly raised his lowered head and ran his fingers across his bald head a few times, as if hoping to put the hair in order, then passed his fingers beneath his nose, as if by accident, and sniffed thoughtfully. "Like caramel?" he asked, attempting to find his stern tone again.
Caramel? What do you know about caramel? Have you ever eaten any?
"Not exactly," said the wet nurse, "but once I was in a grand mansion in the Rue Saint-Honoré and watched how they made it out of melted sugar and cream. It smelled so good that I've never forgotten it."
Yes, all right," said Terrier, and took his finger from his nose. "But please hold your tongue now. I find it quite exhausting to continue a conversation with you on such a level. I have determined that, for whatever reason, you refuse to nourish any longer the babe put under your care, Jean-Baptiste Grenouille, and are returning him herewith to his temporary guardian, the cloister of Saint-Méry. I find that distressing, but I apparently cannot alter the fact. You are discharged."
With that he grabbed the basket, took one last whiff of that fleeting, woolly, warm milkiness, and slammed the door. Then he went to his office. Father Terrier was an educated man. He had not merely studied theology, but had read the philosophers as well, and had dabbled with botany and alchemy on the side. He had a rather high opinion of his own critical faculties. To be sure, he would never go so far as some, who questioned the miracles, the oracles, the very truth of Holy Scripture, even though the biblical texts could not, strictly speaking, be explained by reason alone, indeed often directly contradicted it. He preferred not to meddle with such problems. They were too discomforting for him, and would only land him in the most agonizing insecurity and disquiet, whereas to make use of one's reason one truly needed both security and quiet. What he most vigorously did combat, however, were the superstitious notions of the simple folk. Witches and fortune-telling cards, the wearing of amulets, the evil eye, exorcisms, hocus-pocus at full moon, and all the other acts they performed. It was really quite depressing to see how such heathenish customs had still not been uprooted a good 1,000 years after the firm establishment of the Christian religion. And most instances of so-called satanic possession or pacts with the devil proved on closer inspection to be superstitious mummery. Of course, to deny the existence of Satan himself, to doubt his power, Terrier could not go so far as that. Ecclesiastical bodies other than one small, ordinary monk were assigned the task of deciding about such matters touching the very foundations of theology. But, on the other hand, it was clear as day that when a simple soul like that wet nurse maintained that she had spotted a devilish spirit, the devil himself could not possibly have a hand in it. The very fact that she thought she had spotted him was certain proof that there was nothing devilish to be found, for the devil would certainly never be stupid enough to let himself be unmasked by the wet nurse Jeanne Grenouille, and with her nose no less, with the primitive organ of smell, the basest of the senses, as if hell smelled of sulphur and paradise of incense and myrrh. The worst sort of superstition, straight out of the darkest days of paganism, when people still lived like beasts, possessing no keenness of the eye, incapable of distinguishing colours, but presuming to be able to smell blood, to scent the difference between friend and foe, to be smelled out by cannibal giants and werewolves and the Furies, all the while offering their ghastly gods stinking, smoking, burnt sacrifices. How repulsive! The fool sees with his nose rather than his eyes, they say, and apparently the light of God-given reason would have to shine yet another 1,000 years before the last remnants of such primitive beliefs were banished. Ah, yes, and you, poor little child, innocent creature, lying in your basket and slumbering away with no notion of the ugly suspicions raised against you. That impudent woman dared to claim you don't smell the way human children are supposed to smell. Well, what do we have to say to that? Boop-be-doo. And he rocked the basket gently on his knees, stroking the infant's head with his finger and repeating boop-be-doo from time to time, an expression he thought had a gentle, soothing effect on small children. You're supposed to smell like caramel. What nonsense. Boop-be-doo. After a while he pulled his finger back, held it under his nose and sniffed, but could smell nothing except the choucroute he had eaten at lunch. He hesitated a moment, looked around him to make sure no one was watching, lifted the basket and lowered his fat nose into it. Expecting to inhale an odour, he sniffed all around the infant's head, so close to it that the thin reddish baby hair tickled his nostrils. He did not know exactly how babies' heads were supposed to smell, certainly not like caramel, that much was clear, since caramel was melted sugar, and how could a baby, that until now had drunk only milk, smell like melted sugar? It might smell like wet nurse's milk, but it didn't smell like milk. It might smell like hair, like skin and hair, and maybe a little bit of baby sweat. And Terrier sniffed with the intention of smelling skin, hair, and a little baby sweat. But he smelled nothing. For the life of him, he couldn't. Apparently, an infant has no odour, he thought. That must be it. An infant, assuming it is kept clean, simply doesn't smell, any more than it speaks, or walks, or writes. Such things come only with age. Strictly speaking, human beings first emit an odour when they reach puberty. That's how it is, that's all. Wasn't it Horace himself who wrote, "The youth is gamy as a buck, the maiden's fragrance blossoms as does the white narcissus"? And the Romans knew all about that. The odour of humans is always a fleshly odour, that is, a sinful odour. How could an infant, which does not yet know sin even in its dreams, have an odour? How could it smell? Boop-be-doo. Not a chance of it. He had placed the basket back on his knees and now rocked it gently. The babe still slept soundly. Its right fist, small and red, stuck out from under the cover, and now and then twitched sweetly against his cheek. Terrier smiled and suddenly felt very cosy. For a moment he allowed himself the fantastic thought that he was the father of the child. He had not become a monk, but rather a normal citizen, an upstanding craftsman perhaps, had taken a wife, a warm wife, fragrant with milk and wool, and had produced a son with her, and he was rocking him here on his own knees, his own child. Boop, 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 be-doo. The thought of it made him feel good. There was something so normal and right about the idea. A father rocking his son on his knees, boop-be-doo. A vision as old as the world itself, and yet all was new and normal, as long as the world would exist. Ah, yes. Terrier felt his heart glow with sentimental coziness. Then the child awoke. Its nose awoke first. The tiny nose moved, pushed upwards, and sniffed. It sucked air in and snorted it back out in short puffs, like an imperfect sneeze. Then the nose wrinkled up, and the child opened its eyes. The eyes were of an uncertain colour, between oyster grey and creamy opal white, covered with a kind of slimy film, and apparently not very well adapted for sight. Terrier had the impression that they did not even perceive him. But not so the nose. While the child's dull eyes squinted into the void, the nose seemed to fix on a particular target, and Terrier had the very odd feeling that he himself, his person, Father Terrier, was that target. The tiny wings of flesh around the two tiny holes in the child's face swelled like a bud opening to bloom, or rather like the cups of that small, meat-eating plant that was kept in the Royal Botanical Gardens, and like the plant, they seemed to create an eerie suction. It seemed to Terrier as if the child saw him with its nostrils, as if it was staring intently at him, scrutinizing him more piercingly than eyes could ever do, as if it were using its nose to devour something whole, something that came from him, from Terrier, and that he could not hold that something back or hide it. The child, with no smell, was smelling at him shamelessly. That was it. It was establishing his scent. And all at once he felt as if he stank, of sweat and vinegar, of choucroute and unwashed clothes. He felt naked and ugly, as if someone were gaping at him while revealing nothing of himself. The child seemed to be smelling right through his skin, into his innards. His most tender emotions, his filthiest thoughts, lay exposed to that greedy little nose, which wasn't even a proper nose, but only a pug of a nose, a tiny perforated organ, forever crinkling and puffing and quivering. Terrier shuddered. He felt sick to his stomach. He pulled back his own nose, as if he smelled something foul that he wanted nothing to do with. Gone was the homely thought that this might be his own flesh and blood. Vanished the sentimental idyll of father and son and fragrant mother, as if someone had ripped away the cosy veil of thought that his fantasy had cast about the child and himself. A strange, cold creature lay there on his knees, a hostile animal, and were he not a man by nature prudent, God-fearing, and given to reason, in the rush of nausea he would have hurled it like a spider from him. Terrier wrenched himself to his feet and set the basket on the table. He wanted to get rid of the thing as quickly as possible, right away if possible, immediately if possible. And then it began to wail. It squinted up its eyes, gaped its gullet wide, and gave a screech so repulsively shrill that the blood in Terrier's veins congealed. He shook the basket with an outstretched hand and shouted, "Poopy-doo!" to silence the child, but it only bellowed more loudly and turned completely blue in the face and looked as if it would burst from bellowing. "Away with it," thought Terrier. "Away this very instant with this—" He was about to say devil, but caught himself and restrained. "Away with this monster, with this insufferable child." But away where? He knew a dozen wet nurses and orphanages in the neighborhood, but that was too near, too close for comfort. Get the thing further away. So far away that you couldn't hear it, so far away that it could not be dropped on your doorstep again every hour or so. If possible, it must be taken to another parish. On the other side of the river would be even better, and best of all, extramuros, in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. That was it. That was the place for this screaming brat, far off to the east, beyond the Bastille, where at night the city gates were locked. And he hitched up his cassock and grabbed the bellowing basket and ran off, ran through the tangle of alleys to the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Antoine, eastwards, up the Seine, out of the city, far, far out, to the Rue de Charonne, almost to its very end, where, at an address near the cloister Madeleine de Trenelle, he knew there lived a certain Madame Gaillard, who took children to board, no matter of what age or sort, as long as someone paid for them. And there he handed over the child, still screaming, paid a year in advance, and fled back into the city, and once at the cloister cast his clothes from him as if they were foully soiled, washed himself from head to foot, and crept into bed in his cell, crossing himself repeatedly, praying long, and finally, with some relief, falling asleep. Madame Gaillard's life already lay behind her, though she was not yet 30 years old. To the world she looked as old as her years, and at the same time 2, 3, 100 times older, like the mummy of a young girl. But on the inside she was long since dead. When she was a child, her father had struck her across the forehead with a poker, just above the base of the nose, and she had lost for good all sense of smell and every sense of human warmth and human coldness, indeed every human passion. With that one blow, tenderness had become as foreign to her as enmity, joy as strange as despair. She felt nothing when later she slept with a man, and just as little when she bore her children. She did not grieve over those that died, nor rejoice over those that remained to her. When her husband beat her, she did not flinch, and she felt no sense of relief when he died of cholera in the Hôtel Dieu. The only two sensations that she was aware of were a very slight depression at the approach of her monthly migraine and a very slight elevation of mood at its departure. Otherwise, this numbed woman felt nothing. On the other hand, or perhaps precisely because of her total lack of emotion, Madame Gaillard had a merciless sense of order and justice. She showed no preference for any one of the children entrusted to her, nor discriminated against any one of them. She served up 3 meals a day and not the tiniest snack more. She changed the nappies of the little ones 3 times a day, but only until their 2nd birthday. Whoever shat in his pants after that received an uncensorious slap and 1 less meal. Exactly 1/2 of the boarding fees were spent for her wards, exactly 1/2 she retained for herself. She did not attempt to increase her profits when prices went down, and in hard times she did not charge a single sol extra, even when it was a matter of life and death. Otherwise her business would have been of no value to her. She needed the money. She had figured it down to the penny. In her old age, she wanted to buy an annuity, with just enough beyond that so that she could afford to die at home rather than perish miserably in the Hôtel Dieu as her husband had. The death itself had left her cold, but she dreaded a communal, public death among hundreds of strangers. She wanted to afford a private death, and for that she needed her full cut of the boarding fees. True, there were winters when 3 or 4 of her 24 little boarders died. Still, her record was considerably better than that of most other private foster mothers, and surpassed by far the 2nd of the great public and ecclesiastical orphanages, where the losses often came to 9 out of 10. There were plenty of replacements. Paris produced over 10,000 new foundlings, bastards, and orphans a year. Several such losses were quite affordable. For little Grenouille, Madame Gaillard's establishment was a blessing. He probably could not have survived anywhere else. But here, with this small-souled woman, he throve. He had a tough constitution. Whoever has survived his own birth on a rubbish heap is not so easily shoved back out of this world again. He could eat watery soup for days on end. He managed on the thinnest milk, digested the rottenest vegetables and spoiled meat. In the course of his childhood, he survived the measles, dysentery, chicken-pox, cholera, a 20-foot fall into a well, and a scalding with boiling water poured over his chest. True, he bore scars and chafings and scabs from it all, and a slightly crippled foot left him with a limp. But he lived. He was as tough as a resistant bacterium, and as content as a tick, sitting quietly on a tree and living off a tiny drop of blood plundered years before. He required a minimum ration of food and clothing for his body. For his soul he required nothing. Security, attention, tenderness, love, or whatever all those things are called that children are said to require, were utterly dispensable to the young Grenouille. Or rather, so it seems to us, he had utterly dispensed with them, just to go on living, from the very start. The cry that followed his birth, the cry with which he had brought himself to people's attention and his mother to the gallows, was not an instinctive cry for sympathy and love. That cry, emitted upon careful consideration, one might almost say upon mature consideration, was the newborn's decision against love, and nevertheless for life. Under the circumstances, the latter was possible only without the former, and had the child demanded both, it would doubtless have abruptly come to a grisly end. Of course, it could have grabbed the other possibility open to it and held its peace, and thus have chosen the path from birth to death without a detour by way of life, sparing itself and the world a great deal of mischief. But to have made such a modest exit would have demanded a modicum of native civility, and that Grenouille did not possess. He was an abomination from the start. He decided in favor of life out of sheer spite and sheer malice. Obviously, he did not decide this as an adult would decide, who requires his more or less substantial experience and reason to choose among various options. But he did decide vegetatively, as a bean, when once tossed aside, might decide whether it ought to germinate or had better let things be. Or, like that tick in the tree, for which life has nothing better to offer than perpetual hibernation. The ugly little tick, which by rolling its blue-grey body up into a ball offers the least possible surface to the world, which by making its skin smooth and dense emits nothing, lets not the tiniest bit of perspiration escape. The tick, which makes itself extra small and inconspicuous so that no one will see it and step on it. The lonely tick, which, wrapped up in itself, huddles in its tree, blind, deaf and dumb, and simply sniffs all year long, for miles around, for the blood of some passing animal that it could never reach under its own power. The tick could let itself drop. It could fall to the floor of the forest and creep a millimetre or two here or there on its 6 tiny legs and lie down to die under the leaves. It would be no great loss, God knows. But the tick, stubborn, sullen, and loathsome, huddles there and lives and waits. Waits for that most improbable of chances that will bring blood, in animal form, directly beneath its tree. And only then does it abandon caution and drop and scratch and bore and bite into that alien flesh. The young Grenouille was such a tick. He lived encapsulated in himself and waited for better times. He gave the world nothing but his dung, no smile, no cry, no glimmer in the eye, not even his own scent. Every other woman would have kicked this monstrous child out, but not Madame Gaillard. She could not smell that he did not smell, and she expected no stirrings from his soul, because her own was sealed tight. The other children, however, sensed at once what Grenouille was about. From the first day, the new arrival was a sinister presence to them. They avoided the box in which he lay, and edged closer in their beds as if it had grown colder in the room. The younger ones would sometimes cry out in the night. They felt a draught sweep through the room. Others dreamed something was taking their breath away. One day the older ones conspired to suffocate him. They piled rags and blankets and straw over his face and weighed it all down with bricks. When Madame Gaillard dug him out the next morning, he was crumpled and squashed and blue, but not dead. They tried it a few more times, but in vain. Simple strangulation, using their bare hands or stopping up his mouth and nose, which would have been a more dependable method, they did not dare try. They didn't want to touch him. He disgusted them the way a fat spider that you can't bring yourself to crush with your own hand disgusts you. As he grew older, they gave up their attempted murders. They probably realized that he could not be destroyed. Instead, they stayed out of his way, ran off, or at least avoided touching him. They did not hate him. They weren't jealous of him either, nor did they begrudge him the food he ate. There was not the slightest cause for such feelings in the Gaillard household. It simply disturbed them that he was there. They could not smell him.